Good evening. So I'm Janice Munger, the Executive Director of the Alice Austen House. And on behalf of the Board of Directors and staff, I'm delighted to be here tonight at the Whitney Museum of American Art in honor of Alice Austen's 150th birthday this year and Women's History Month. Thank you so much for joining us to hear these distinguished scholars share new insights about the early American photographer Alice Austen. This program is the culmination of a planning grant to help the museum update and expand the interpretation of Alice Austen's life and work. We thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for generously funding this project, and Con Edison and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for their support of tonight's program. I would like to thank the Whitney for partnering on this event, and especially Megan Hoyer, Jane Panetta, and Elizabeth Sussman, and Donald Moffett for connecting us as well. Thank you also to our colleagues at Historic Richmond Town for collaborating with us to share Alice Austen's images as the result of their work to catalog and digitize more than 7,000 of her photographs. And mostly, I want to thank the scholars who have really, truly poured themselves into this project with great dedication, thoughtfulness, and passion, and you will hear that tonight. And now to Alice Austen, a remarkable woman who was a trailblazer and left us an astonishing photographic record of Victorian life on Staten Island and a changing New York City at the turn of the 20th century. We'll hear tonight from the scholars about pertinent themes in Alice Austen's photography and her life. Let me touch briefly upon who she was as a woman. Alice Austen was born Elizabeth Alice Munn on March 17, 1866 on Staten Island. Abandoned by her father as an infant, baby Alice and her mother moved into her grandparents' home, Clear Comfort, a Victorian Gothic cottage on the waterfront of Staten Island at the entrance to the New York Narrows. Alice Austen was raised in a lively household with her grandparents and a spunky aunt and a worldly uncle. The home itself was built as a one-room Dutch farmhouse dating to about 1690, so making it one of the oldest homes in New York City. Alice Austen's grandfather, John Austen, purchased the home in 1844 and made renovations that give the house its Victorian Gothic character. Alice Austen lived in this home for 78 years of her life, and many of her photographs were taken there. Her historic home is now the Alice Austen House Museum. Alice Austen was given a camera at age 10 by her uncle, Oswald Mueller, who was a Danish sea captain and also took photographs himself. Another uncle, Peter, was a chemist and would have guided Alice Austen on darkroom processes. But largely, she was self-taught and became technically proficient at an early age. She took thousands of photographs, mostly glass plate negatives, and she diligently noted the subject, the date and time, the lens and equipment she used, and the length of exposure and light conditions. And this is an example of one of the envelopes with her handwriting. Alice Austen lived what she called the larky life, privileged enough to focus on her photography and leisure pursuits. Austen excelled in many activities, and many of which were unusual for a woman at the time. She was an early advocate for women riding bicycles. She played the banjo. She was an early tennis player. She founded the Staten Island Garden Club. She is said to be the first woman on Staten Island to own a car, a 1909 Franklin, and she was a volunteer ambulance driver during World War I. And this is Alice Austen on the left. She enjoyed parties, and her sense of humor and wit is evident in her photographs. In 1899, she met Gertrude Tate, a kindergarten teacher and social dance instructor from Brooklyn, while the two were at a resort in the Catskills. A personal photo album Alice made that summer reveals that Alice was enchanted with Gertrude. Gertrude began to regularly visit the Austen home and then to spend summer holidays in Europe with Alice. In 1917, Gertrude Tate moved into Clear Comfort with Alice Austen, and the couple made a life together. After leading a rather carefree life, everything changed in 1929 when the family money was lost in the historic stock market crash. From that point on, Alice and Gertrude had to make ends meet. They even opened a tea room on their lawn to try to make some money, but eventually they could no longer make the mortgage payments and were evicted. After living in the home all of her life, Alice Austen was forced to leave her beloved Clear Comfort. Alice and Gertrude rented an apartment together nearby for a while until they couldn't afford the rent. Then Gertrude Tate went to live with her family. However, Alice was not welcomed and had health issues. She declared an oath of poverty and was taken to the Staten Island farm colony, the poorhouse on Staten Island, at age 84. At this time, a historian rediscovered the wealth of her photographs that had been taken to the Staten Island Historical Society right before Alice Austen sold off her possessions. They tried to raise some money to move Alice into a private nursing home, which they did. They were successful in licensing the images to Life magazine, and Alice Austen received some recognition with a spread in Life in September 1951 with photographs taken by Alfred Eisenstadt. Alice Austen died months later on June 9th, 1952, at age 86. That the Alice Austen House exists today as a protected New York City and national landmark and a public museum is due to a massive preservation effort in the 1960s and 1970s. Since the site was zoned for high-rise development, we could have easily lost this treasure. Thankfully, a group of influential people in art and culture, along with many local citizens, banded together to form the Friends of Alice Austen House to save the home and convince the city to purchase the property and protect it as a landmark. The Friends group included such high-profile individuals as Berenice Abbott, Edward Steichen, Alfred Eisenstadt, Philip Johnson, and Margot Gale. Opened as a public museum in 1985, the Alice Austen House now presents changing exhibitions of Alice Austen's work and contemporary photography, with solo exhibitions of artists working in the vein of Alice Austen, and group exhibitions inspired by themes from her life and work that speak to their relevance today. The current exhibition is Staten Island Unlimited, the borough's inaugural triennial of photography featuring the work of 35 photographers from 3 boroughs. And I invite you all to journey across the water to experience this incredible place. The findings presented by the scholars this evening arose out of the need for the Alice Austen House to reassess the museum's permanent installation that hadn't been updated substantially in many years. The museum had many questions about how to address the significance of Alice Austen. How do we situate Alice Austen's work in early American photography and in the course of art history? What distinguishes her from her contemporaries? What do her extensive photographs of immigrants in quarantine stations contribute to the telling of New York City and US history? How do we understand Alice Austen's pursuits as a woman, breaking boundaries for her era? And how do we talk about Alice Austen's relationship with Gertrude Tate in the early 20th century, especially considering that the museum had been criticized by the LGBT community in the past for not acknowledging the relationship enough? And now that it is an unprecedented time for gay rights, but when true equality is still a work in progress, what can Alice and Gertrude's historic relationship offer? These considerations are what led the museum to explore and make the public aware of the broader significance of Alice Austen and be more expansive and inclusive in our interpretation, leading to the request to the National Endowment for the Humanities to bring together these 5 scholars this evening from relevant fields to really investigate these questions. The scholars met at the museum for 2 days in November 2015 and reconvened today, and will meet again tomorrow to culminate this project. Tonight, you'll hear their exceptional insights that offer new eyes on Alice Austen. And now I'd like to invite tonight's moderator, Denise Rompilla, to introduce the scholars. Thank you.
Good evening. It is my pleasure to introduce the scholars for tonight's discussion. Lillian Faderman is an internationally known scholar of lesbian history and literature. She is the author of 3 New York Times notable books, Surpassing the Love of Men, Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, and The Gay Revolution, The Story of the Struggle. Sarah Kate Gillespie is curator of American art at the Georgia Museum of Art, University of Georgia, where she also teaches in the art history program at the Lamar Dodd School of Art. She is the author of The Early American Daguerreotype, Cross-Currents in Art and Technology. Richard Meyer is the Robert and Ruth Halperin Professor in Art History at Stanford University. He is the author of What Was Contemporary Art and co-author with Catherine Lord of Art and Queer Culture. Lara Vapnek is the author of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Modern American Revolutionary, and Breadwinners, Working Women and Economic Independence. She is an associate professor of history at St. John's University. Laura Wexler is professor of American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Film and Media Studies at Yale University. She is the director of photography. She is the director of the Photographic Memory Workshop, and additionally, she's the principal investigator of the NEH-supported Photogrammer Project, which is a digital map and research tool for more than 170,000 photographs taken between 1935 and 1945. She's the author of Tender Violence, Domestic Visions in an Age of US Imperialism.
All right, I guess I'm starting here, so. Hi, I'm Sarah Kate in that list of scholars, the one from the South. So I'd like to thank Janice and Denise for all their hard work, and of course Janice for the invitation to work with the scholars in the first place, and of course everyone else here on this team. It's been just a real pleasure, and I really look forward to continuing this. So I'm going to speak to you tonight about Austen's place in the larger trajectory of the history of photography, just briefly so that we can situate her and think about what other people were doing at the same time. And I wanted to start with this particular image that you're going to see repeated several times tonight when some of my colleagues speak with you as well. Speaking on their particular context. I am interested in this image, however, because it shows Austen herself, and that's her perched on the fence with one of her cameras, as a looker, right? So she is looking and doing this important, and if we really think about it in her time period of the 1890s and the early 20th century, what we can almost call radical act of a woman taking a camera out into a public sphere and using it in a professional, and that word gets a little hairy, but we're going to say for right now, a professional capacity. Now, women with cameras in the late 19th, early 20th century, in and of themselves, that was not particularly radical. That was not particularly different. There had been women taking photographs since the advent of photography in the late 1830s, certainly, and through the 1840s. This just continues to grow and grow and grow as the 19th century progresses. And certainly in the late 19th century, there are more female photographers than ever, particularly with the advent of the Kodak Brownie camera. You push the button, we do the rest, was the motto. These were specifically marketed towards women to use in domestic circumstances, on the one hand, to document their potentially growing families, and then also marketed towards the quote-unquote new woman, of which we'll hear quite a bit more about from Lara when she speaks, to document their sort of greater mobility and greater freedom. What we don't see very many women doing, save Alice Austen in this time period, is doing what we would today term street photography, right? Street photography. Things that we think of as a really later 20th century trend of photographers taking the camera just out into the street and documenting it, documenting what they come across and what they find. Of course, later you think of people like Berenice Abbott, to a certain degree you can even say Dorothea Lange, Consuelo Kanaga, et cetera, Vivian Meyer, the recently rediscovered Diane Arbus, but not so much in this era. So this is one of her photographs that can be qualified as this street photography, a street sweeper. Now, Austen, like many female photographers, I think, of the late 19th, early 20th century, has been in some ways overlooked in the history of photography. Historians, we tend to know who she is, but she's not as well known as some of the other names I just mentioned to the wider public. And I think what we'll see as we run through this panel tonight is that it's because she occupies somewhat liminal spaces within the history as it's been constructed. It gets back to that sort of hairy word of professional. She is neither fully professional as it's come to be defined, nor is she fully amateur. And it also gets to this word of documentarian. She does and she doesn't document what she sees. You know, she does in the sense that she just it is clearly a document of something, but the way we've come to understand a documentarian photographer, particularly one for social reform purposes, she's not engaged in those kinds of activities. So we don't quite know where to put her. She's got a foot in many, many, many camps, and she's sort of doing her own thing. And like I said, the street photography is fairly unusual for a woman of her period. She has been classified as the first. I certainly would say she is among the first. You know, maybe somebody will surface at a later date who was doing these sorts of activities prior to her. Now, getting back to the sort of professional amateur question, this work, along with another one I'm going to show you, she copyrighted them and put them into a portfolio for sale. And that to me is something that we could qualify as professional, right? You know, looking to make money from her imagery. But then we're going to see, you saw on the slideshow that was running in through some of the images that Janice showed you, there's a lot of personal imagery as well, a lot of domestic imagery. So that's where some of that elision comes from. Now, a word about her process. As mentioned, she worked mostly with glass plate negatives. She worked in the dry plate process. The dry plate method. She would often, according to her main biographer, Anne Novotny, she would often carry two cameras, since these are the plates. You know, she can't enlarge them or reduce them. So she would often carry two cameras to make images of different sizes. She's carrying upwards to what we think of as 50 pounds, perhaps, of photographic equipment when she goes on these journeys into the streets of Manhattan from Staten Island. So with all of that in mind, we can think about what other people were doing at the same time. Who else was out in the streets taking pictures, right? So we've thought about women photographers, what they were doing primarily. One of the main strains of what we see happening in this late 19th, early 20th century period of street photography is that more muckraking social documentary photography as exemplified by someone like Jacob Riis or Lewis Hine. Riis, of course, publishing his How the Other Half Lives, first as a series in Scribner's in 1889, and then the full book comes out in 1890. And you know, really meant to change conditions in tenements as a vehicle for reform. So using the photograph as a visual expression of reform. This is clearly not what Austen is doing. You can just even tell by the way the two images are framed. Her newsboy looks clean, he looks shiny, he looks happy. You know, he is cheerfully handing out a paper. He is not sleeping at 2 a.m. in the corner of a press room, you know, with a sad little hat pulled over his eyes. So really different approaches to what they are encountering in the streets. And I should say that this newsboy image and her street sweeper image, you can see the street types of New York portfolio. So one of the things that I think is an avenue for further research is this idea of the street type and who this portfolio is being marketed towards. Is it being marketed towards people in the city, in New York City, to see the sorts of types they might encounter all the time? Is it being marketed towards people outside of the city to familiarize themselves with these, you know, sort of almost touristic kinds of street types that they might encounter? And we see this term type sometimes applied later in the 20th century to other photographers, notably in Europe, August Sander, but also the photographer Doris Ullman and some other people as well. Now, you can see in the street sweeper and in the newsboy, these are also carefully posed subjects. And as I mentioned, if she's carrying about 50 pounds worth of equipment, she's working with the glass plates. This is going to take some time to set up. This is not a snapshot aesthetic, right? So she's not just running through sort of taking things willy-nilly. She's got to set up and then set her subjects up. That said, however, You see from the image on the left, she is capable of taking photographs that have this wonderful spontaneous quality as well. So she obviously had to set up that equipment, as I said, but then waits to actually take the shot until there's this sort of casual moment with the image on the left. Very different from what we see somebody like Paul Strand on the right doing, who is working with a hidden lens, a hidden camera. He put a fake lens on the side of his camera to photograph his subject unawares. He doesn't want them to know that he's taking the picture. You can't avoid Alice Austen and her 50 pounds of equipment when she's coming at you with her camera. You know, she's there. And so even just bringing Paul Strand up brings up the question, of course, of the other main strain of photography that's happening. Of course, there are others, but these are sort of two of the main ones in this era, and that is the development of the photo secession and the movement of art photography, again, put that in quotes too, art photography, as exemplified by Alfred Stieglitz, Paul Strand, Edward Steichen, and the Victorialist movement, and then moving into more what we would term modern photography. It's exemplified by someone like Strand here. And Austen seems to have no interest in this either. She's working concurrently with these folks. She is certainly a very well-educated woman. She is, going in and out of the city all the time. It seems impossible to believe that she would not have had an awareness of this very important, burgeoning photographic group in society, and yet she keeps herself separate. She just sort of does her own thing. So that's just sort of to give you an idea of how radical her works were and her action was to go out into the street with the camera. That's all right. That's my signal. We'll move on.
Hi, I'm Lara Vapnek, and I will be discussing Alice Austen as a new woman. But first, I want to thank Janice and Denise for inviting me to participate in this project. It's been amazing. I have learned so much already, and I'm looking forward to learning more. The new woman appeared in large cities around the world in the late 19th and early 20th century. She was alternatively celebrated and vilified as a harbinger of modernity. Most often depicted as young, single, American-born, and white, she was a product of new technologies and educational opportunities, and she embodied women's possibilities for living a life that transcended the domestic sphere. Of course, there was no singular new woman. In fact, women from a variety of ethnic and racial backgrounds sought greater individual development and a wider social role. By pursuing photography, Austen joined a new generation of women who sought an existence beyond the family claim. Women's ability to reach beyond the domestic sphere varied according to their race and class, and Austen used her relatively privileged position to become a photographer who produced subversive images of domesticity. Furthermore, she took advantage of new modes of transportation to travel far beyond home and to document the rapidly changing world around her. And in my brief presentation, I want to focus on Austen as a new woman by discussing three modes of transportation that she used: the ferry, the bicycle, and the railroad. So obviously here we're starting with the ferry, which seems fitting for a Staten Island subject. And I particularly like this photograph that Austen took while she was crossing the harbor from Staten Island to Manhattan. And I think that the large number of women that are sitting out on the deck of the ferry is worth noticing. Since it is mid-morning, they are not headed to work. That means they're probably not working class women. Instead, they're likely to be elite or middle class women who are out for a day of shopping, club meetings, outings in Central Park, or in Austen's case, to roam the streets to take photographs. And as Sarah has just explained, Austen's street photography brought her into contact with people from different ethnic backgrounds and social classes. In 1890, the recently consolidated ferry service took Austen out of her relatively sheltered suburban environment in Staten Island and into the intense urbanity of Manhattan, which was the first home for millions of immigrants arriving from Europe. Unlike many new women, Austen does not seem to have been a reformer, but she was certainly an investigator of the dramatic changes that were taking place in the world around her, including immigration, new scientific processes, and more rapid motion. Austen was intrigued by speed, and this is something that people who lived through the Gilded Age often remarked upon, that the world just seemed to speed up after the Civil War. And I think we can kind of sense that in Austen's pictures. So she took photographs of all sorts of boats and vehicles, as well as people playing tennis, performing gymnastics, and bicycling, a form of transportation which combined individual momentum with mechanical innovation. By showing women in motion, Austen challenged viewers to think about gender in new ways. And this next slide shows a Staten Island bicycle club tea. Interestingly, the bicycle club included both men and women, and it suggests some of the new leisure activities that became available to the middle class during the Gilded Age and Progressive era. Austen's friend, Maria Ward, stands at the center of the group, pictured here, wearing a rather distinctive sculptural black hat. Bicycling for ladies posed particular challenges to propriety and to women's previous experience that Ward tackled in a book of the same name. Austen helped Ward with the book by taking photographs that became the basis for the illustrations. She used her friend, Daisy Elliott, a gymnast, as a model. And you will note that in both of these pictures, the model is wearing bloomers, which were a symbol of female emancipation. Although if you actually read Bicycling for Ladies, they don't recommend wearing bloomers. They sort of assume women will still be wearing corsets, but they recommend that you find a corset that has elastic on the sides, which supposedly will be more comfortable. Bicycling for Ladies instructed women on proper riding form, suitable clothing, and how to use tools to adjust the bike or fix flat tires. Austen most likely agreed with Ward that the chief pleasure of bicycling is independence and the joy of being free. And I would argue that for women like Austen, who came of age in the late 19th century, the mobility enabled by the bicycle had a particular significance. It celebrated a new athleticism among women, and it suggested the thrill of travel and discovery, whether in Staten Island, Manhattan, or setting off for longer journeys. And this slide shows Austen shaking hands with her dog before she departs for the World's Columbian Exposition. And I think it's very telling that the caption begins self-starting for Chicago. I love this phrase because I think it suggests that through her photography and her travel, Austen actualized herself. This was a thoroughly modern project for a woman that was indicative of her time and would have been very difficult a generation earlier. And I would argue that even if Austen did not need to earn a living and came from a social set that viewed women's wage earning as déclassé, she took her photography very seriously and pursued it, I agree, as sort of a profession in that it required skill and dedication, and I think that she used it as an opening to see more of the world. In order to reach Chicago, Austen would have traveled by train, most likely on a Pullman car, where she, like the other wealthy passengers, would have been served by African-American men who had once been slaves. Like other members of her class, Austen's race and gender were defined in part by not having to serve others either at home or in commercial settings. By choosing not to marry or have children, and this is something that Lillian is going to discuss further, Austen freed herself from the domestic labor expected of wives and mothers, opening more time and ability to pursue her photography. She spent 2 weeks in Chicago photographing the World's Fair, and she copyrighted 25 of her images. And this is one of them. Just as the railroad reflected racial distinctions, so too did the fair, which was known as the White City. African Americans were excluded from attending except on particular days, and the exhibit celebrated white Anglo-Saxon Protestant achievements as the apogee of civilization. People from other parts of the world were exhibited as curiosities and relegated to the more carnivalesque midway. Austen's photographs focused on the grand neoclassical architecture that was at the center of the fair. Her ability to travel to Chicago in order to produce these photographs reminds us that the privileges of the new woman were not universally shared. They required time, money, and a particular racial identity in order to participate fully. I close with this observation not to dismiss Austen, but rather to place her more firmly in her historical context and to flag the ways that race and class intersected with gender to shape her identity as a new woman and to create a particular vantage point from which she viewed and documented the world. Thank you.
I'm Lillian Faderman, and I want to thank Janice and Denise for bringing us together for this really amazing event. You've done a wonderful job. Thank you. The story goes that when Alice Austen and her wonderful photographs were discovered in 1951 by magazine editor and writer Oliver Jensen, he asked why she never married. He was told that she was too good to marry, by which was meant she was too good at sports, too good at mechanics, and too good at photography to be pleasing to the men of her day. However, she was married, actually, for more than 50 years. Her marriage wasn't recognized by the law, but it was like many marriages in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that were entered into by pairs of women of the middle and upper classes who chose to follow careers or artistic passions rather than to become wives and mothers. The poet Amy Lowell had such a marriage with the actress Ada Russell until Lowell's death in 1926. Nobel Prize winner Jane Addams, who pioneered in the settlement house movement, had such a marriage with Chicago heiress Mary Rosett Smith, who was her partner for more than 30 years. The early 20th century president of Mount Holyoke College, Mary Woolley, had such a marriage with English professor Jeanette Marks, who was her partner for more than 50 years. These long-term, devoted domestic partnerships were so common during the era that they were dubbed Boston marriages, probably after Henry James' 1885 novel, The Bostonians, which is about a passionate relationship between two female characters. There was probably no term to describe these relationships with which women in Boston marriages would have been comfortable. Lesbian suggested decadence, a la Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil, and other such works by scandalous French writers. Homosexual put the emphasis on sex alone. Invert suggested pathology. There's actually a 1930 memoir called The Stone Wall, written under the pseudonym Mary Casal, which looks back over the author's life of in the early 20th century. And Casal describes the passion. She even talks about the sexual passion of her love affair with another woman who was also a college-educated, middle-class professional, as Mary Casal was. But Casal makes a big distinction between her and her lover and the working-class lesbians that they briefly encounter on an expedition to the Bowery. Quote, "Our lives were on a much higher plane than those of the real inverts," she says. That is, those women in the Bowery were inverts, lesbians, but Casal and her partner simply loved each other. So my point is that while these middle and upper class women couples might not have had a comfortable name for their relationship, they were inarguably committed to one another, they were the central person in one another's lives, and they were as much married till death did them part as they would have been had they been permitted to take that vow. Alice Austen met Gertrude Tate in 1899 in the Catskills, where she'd gone to visit friends. The picture that you've been looking at is a penny photograph taken of the two of them by a local Staten Island photographer. Alice was 33 when the two women met, and Gertrude was in her mid-20s. There was a class difference between them. Alice's family was well off, and Gertrude worked as a dance instructor and an elementary school teacher to support her mother and younger sister. But despite the class differences and the socioeconomic differences, they became inseparable. This picture shows Alice taking photographs and Gertrude faithfully there, as she would be for many decades to come, supporting Alice in her work and sharing her life. That life that they shared was much more lavish than Gertrude had been used to. For instance, almost every summer they would go to Europe, as in this picture taken on a river in Scotland. Though they were inseparable, they didn't live together for the first 18 years of their relationship because Gertrude felt obliged to stay with her mother and younger sister in Brooklyn and be responsible for their household. Finally, though, in 1917, Gertrude's mother and sister decided to give up the Brooklyn house and move into an apartment, and Gertrude saw her chance. She announced that she would be moving into Clear Comfort, Alice's home on Staten Island. Gertrude's sister was horrified. She'd guessed the nature of the relationship, which she called a, quote, wrong devotion. Gertrude was by now in her 40s, but her sister still hadn't given up the idea that she ought to marry a man. And obviously that was never going to happen, although the sister continued to interfere to the very end, as I'll talk about. Gertrude was by no means a strikingly beautiful woman, but I think Alice saw her through the eyes of love and made her beautiful and even glamorous in her photographs, such as this one titled Gertrude in the Parlor that was taken in 1917. That was the year that Gertrude moved into Alice's home. Alice used to say she'd led a larky life, meaning that her economic circumstances had made it possible for her to devote much of her life to pleasure, though of course we have a very good record of how serious she was about both her art and her craft as a photographer. For many years, Gertrude Tate shared that larky life with Alice, not only frequent trips to Europe, but membership in the Posh Colony Club in Manhattan, tickets to the Metropolitan Opera every Saturday afternoon, until Alice was 63 years old and Gertrude 57 in 1929 when the stock market crashed and they lost everything. But they were married, for richer or for poorer, and so they struggled on together. They mortgaged Clear Comfort, they sold Alice's heirlooms, Gertrude taught dance classes and did broadcasts of charm courses over a Newark radio station. They even opened a tea room on the property, which struggled along. The tea room struggled along until 1941. In this picture, they're still on the property, and it's 1944. In 1945, the bank finally evicted them and they moved to a small apartment. By then, Alice was suffering from health problems, and when Gertrude had a fall and broke her arm, she could no longer take care of her. There was no solution except for Alice to move, and she moved into a series of inexpensive nursing homes, and Gertrude moved to Queens with her family. But Gertrude visited Alice every week in the various nursing homes, and finally in the Staten Island farm colony for paupers, where Alice was sent when there wasn't even money for the inexpensive nursing homes. Alice died in 1952. She had one wonderful year from 1951 to 52 when her photographs were discovered and she became a celebrity. The plan had always been for Alice and Gertrude to be buried next to one another. Alice was buried in her family plot at the Moravian Cemetery, and 10 years later, when Gertrude died in 1962, her sister declared that the, quote, red tape and expense of burying her near Alice was prohibitive, and so Gertrude is buried in her family plot in Brooklyn. But why do we need to know all of this instead of simply enjoying Alice Austen's extraordinary photographs? Because it gives us an insight into some of the most iconic yet baffling of her pictures, such as the one of the women couples gazing at one another, or the playful or transgressive photographs of women in men's drag, or Alice and her friend Trude, masked, smoking, half undressed, and sassy. For years, the part of Alice Austen's life that showed her to be what our era would call lesbian had been repressed by those wishing to, quote, save her reputation. Now we can finally talk about it without stigma. And it's as relevant as knowing that the woman in Renoir's Lise with a Parasol was his mistress, or that Claude Monet's favorite model, Camille, became his wife.
Well, I repeat the thanks. And we all of us repeat it, and we all of us repeat it so authentically. Now, I want you to picture where Alice Austen lived. And we saw, I don't think I can get back to the Clear Comfort picture very easily, but you saw that. If you haven't been to the Alice Austen house, you have to know that it's right. Clear Comfort is beautifully situated at the Narrows in the mouth of New York Harbor. It has a broad and magnificent view of the shipping traffic coming in and out of the port, bringing people and products to and fro from literally all over the world. Alice Austen herself was the niece of a ship captain who had given her, as we heard, her first camera and taught her the rudiments of how to use it. Over many decades, she and her friends and family would sit on the veranda or stand at the end of the garden path, gazing out over the water at the busy shipping lanes. Or she would set up her large view camera at the edge of the property and photograph the passing vessels. It was a fascinating and obvious and unavoidable question. Who was coming in and out of the port of New York on those ships? By the time that Alice Austen was born in 1866, the country itself had asked and tried to answer that question a number of times. In 1790, the brand new nation of the United States adopted a rule that any free white person could apply for citizenship after 2 years of residency. Shortly thereafter, these are the Alien and Sedition Acts that we learned in high school that we didn't understand, at least I didn't. In 1798, the residency requirement was raised from 2 to 14 years, and the possibility of deportation of dangerous aliens was added. In 1880, the residency requirement was reduced again, but to 5-year terms. In 1819, the government first began to register those who were leaving as well, those who were bound for Europe. By 1846, Irish people of all classes facing the potato famine were emigrating to the United States. About 10 years later, in 1857, as the abolition crisis was boiling over, the Dred Scott decision made it clear that free black people were not citizens no matter what residency and had no rights, quote, that the court was bound to respect. In 1864, there were new rules for importing contract laborers. In 1868, the 14th Amendment gave or guaranteed or restored African Americans their full citizenship rights. And the federal government took control of immigration law from the states. By 1880, the population of the United States stood at about 50 million people. And in the next decade, more than 5.2 million immigrants entered the United States. 50 million people and 5.2 million more in a decade. Large numbers of them came through the Port of New York. Jacob Riis had started making his photographic surveys and excursions and published How the Other Half Lives in 1840. Alice was 14 years old. She'd been looking at the shipping lanes virtually all her life and photographing for 4 years. In 1890, 15% of the population of the United States had been born in another country, increasingly drawn from Southern and Eastern Europe rather than as earlier from Northern and Western Europe. To control the flow of immigrants on the East Coast, Ellis Island opened in 1892, enforcing on the West Coast the Chinese Exclusion Act that officially forbade Chinese immigration. Anarchists, epileptics, polygamists, and beggars were among the first to be refused. Women, it was said by an Ellis Island official, traveling alone must be met by a man or couldn't land on the mainland, or they were in danger of immediate deportation. In 1906, English became a requirement for entry, and that soon turned into a more complex literacy test. In 1907, quote, people with physical and mental defects, along with those who had tuberculosis, and children unaccompanied by a parent were turned away. So by the time that the young Alice Austen began photographing the shipping channels, what persons could come in and out had been codified in great detail, and she was likely to have been quite aware of the categories of desirable and undesirable immigrants. But it's not only the movements of persons that concerned the authorities. They were worried also by the possibility of epidemics of communicable diseases that traveled with the people on those ships. A cholera epidemic that had started in 1832 in New York City caused a massive number of deaths up and down the East Coast. Throughout the 19th century, yellow fever, tuberculosis, malaria, influenza, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and bubonic plague threatened and caused public health emergencies. Too often, the people who suffered from such diseases were dehumanized and treated as if they were the diseases themselves. Living on Staten Island, Alice Austen and her family had a front seat view of this history as well. Staten Island historically was the chosen place for the city to deposit its infectious patients and its fear of pestilence. And Staten Islanders, who were largely farmers and oystermen, resented this tremendously. In 1858, just before Alice Austen was born, shortly before she was born, the New York Marine Hospital, known as the Quarantine, a complex of 20 buildings housing around 1,500 people at a time in Tompkinsville, Staten Island, was burned to the ground by a mob of arsonists and vigilantes. No one was killed, but there was a famous trial in which the ringleaders were acquitted, in part on the basis of the higher law that they had of self-defense. The Quarantine was subsequently relocated offshore on a floating ship hospital, and in 1866, the year of her birth, it was moved to Swinburne and Hoffman Islands off the coast of South Beach near Clear Comfort. Decades later, that went to Ellis Island. Like many families that had suffered deaths due to disease, Alice Austen's grandparents had moved to Staten Island in part to escape the pestilence in the city. It would have been impossible for Austen not to be aware of this foreboding history as well as she gazed out at the Chipping Channel. These themes of the attraction and the danger of strangers, of modernity and its malevolence, of riot and control, merge in some of the strongest and most important work that Alice Austen did as a photographer. This is the Quarantine series. This work came about when this man, Dr. Alva H. Doty, who is the chief health officer of the Port of New York, appointed in 1895 and likely a family friend, hired Alice to make a set of photographs of the sterilization and quarantine facilities at Hoffman and Swinburne Islands. Doty was a cutting-edge public health scientist, and his methods of quarantine and his methods of sterilization were written up and were admired throughout the country by his professional peers. He also had been in charge of eradicating mosquitoes from Staten Island, so he's a well-known figure on Staten Island, and very advanced control of the public health facilities. Here's some professional praise. Previous to Dr. Doty's original appointment, the quarantine regulations had been managed in such a way that New York City was often threatened with contagious diseases brought in through the port. Dr. Doty's management of infectious and quarantinable diseases has prevented the recurrence of such dangers. Now, Alice Austen had her own, as we've heard already, her own idiosyncratic approach to photography. Instead of camera work, she was reading popular mechanics. She was interested in science. She had a car that she knew how to fix. She knew how to break down a bicycle and put it back together again. And in these photographs, which is the Quarantine series, which are among my very favorite of Alice Austen's photographs, she displays this kind of a way of being a photographer and this kind of a way of being a woman photographer. It's absolutely extraordinary. These are extraordinary images. She's fascinated with disinfecting. You can see he's hosing down the barracks, and the iron bedsteads can be lifted up and attached to the wall so that the entire floor can be disinfected. She is fascinated by these huge sort of autoclaves, steam disinfecting chambers that are she takes these photographs and then the Public Health Service exhibits them in the Pan American Exposition and in other places around the country to show how good the work at disinfecting is on the Swinburne and Hoffman Islands and how good her photographs are of that work. She was paid for these photographs. It's part of her professional identity. However, this work stopped. And she did it for over a decade, but the work stopped when Dr. Doty encountered a scandal. And in 1911, it was alleged that he was incompetent at his job, and he was running the quarantine services like, that it was just derelict and a mess. Somebody said it was like the Willowbrook scandal, maybe. And he was removed. He was actually removed from his position, despite the fact that the whole elite band of physicians, Flexner is one name, a lot of famous names, wrote a letter on his behalf. He was removed from that position and not restored to it, and given another very well-paying position, but not in the Public Health Service. And Alice Austen also stopped photographing the Quarantine series. Now, these are very unusual and strong photographs to be taken at this time. This is not a sentimental interior. This is somebody that's interested in machines and mechanics and population control and how do you actually do something when you need to do it and who does it and how is it done. In closing, I want to suggest that the scandal itself also probably interested her as well as it probably made her uneasy. I mean, Dr. Doty was very well regarded on Staten Island and a family friend. And we have heard about the unorthodox or wrong devotion that she could be accused, or her Gertrude Tate could be accused of by her very own sister. And the possibility of scandal, the domestic unconscious of the strangers and the immigrants and the isolation and the disinfecting of these people is perhaps part of the power of the visual unconscious in these photographs, because Alice's life, although very privileged until very close to the end of it, nonetheless also had a certain kind of threat of being an outcast, always as an undertone. So this series of photographs, the quarantine series, and there are many of them, is actually an extraordinary production by this extraordinary photographer, and is actually one of my favorite groups of her photographs. Thank you.
When she was a woman of 40, the photographer clambered up a high fence beside the racetrack, focusing her European press camera on the turn-of-the-century automobile speed trials on Staten Island. One friend who was with her raised his own camera to record the photographer, so we can see Elizabeth Alice Austen up there still, oblivious to her observer and to the other spectators around her, and not giving a tinker's damn that her ankles are exposed below her long skirt in a most unladylike manner. The lover who was to share Alice's life and her enthusiasms for over 50 years, Gertrude Amelia Tate, is smiling quizzically at the second photographer. She and he may be sharing amusement at how very characteristic this unconventional pose is for Alice. The passage I have just read opens a 1977 article titled Alice Austen's World by the writer and biographer Anne Novotny. One of the things I most admire about this opening passage is the manner in which it shifts midway through, yet all but imperceptibly, from the past tense to the present. And this shift pivots on a moment of photographic capture. Quote, one friend who was with her raised his own camera to record the photographer, and so we can see Elizabeth Alice Austen up there still, oblivious to her spectator, and so on. From that moment on in the passage, we are invited to inhabit the world of the picture, this photograph of the act of photography, as though it were still in the process of unfolding. There are two more things I'd like to share with you about this passage. In it, Novotny uses the word lover to describe Gertrude Tate, a word conspicuously absent from the trade press book on Austen that Novotny published the year before this article. That is, she published a book which is still to this date the only book-length study of Alice Austen. It's now out of print. We know that there will be many, we hope, and trust, there will be other books in the future. But as of now, there is no book in print on Alice Austen. But the person who wrote that book, in the year after it was published by a trade press, which used the word friend or companion to describe Gertrude Tate, used the word lover. To understand the circumstances of this shift from friend to lover, there's one more piece of contextual information I need to provide, and that is the venue where Anne Novotny's article was published, which was the 1977 Lesbian Art and Artists issue of the radical feminist magazine Heresies. The cover of that issue offers a map of Lesbos, but Lesbos no longer as a Greek island off the coast of Turkey in the Aegean, so much as the center of a topographic world, a world at once imaginary, a world at once real and imaginary. Although the letters spelling Greece appear on the map, they are parenthetical to Lesbos and bereft of their inaugural G. This is not, I think, so much a map of nations or continents, but of an imagined homeland of desire and difference. Some of Austen's most inventive pictures depict the female friends and companions that comprised her immediate social world in the 1890s. The photographer and her friends variously embrace, share a bed, feign smoking or intoxication, dress up as nuns, or show their corsets and petticoats to the camera. The sheer charisma of a photograph such as Trude and I, which you see on the screen, and the broader consideration of female pleasure, masquerade, and intimate exchange within Austen. That was my mother, by the way. Or some contraption she brought with her. The broader consideration of female pleasure, masquerade, and intimate exchange within Austen's world makes it clear, I think, why her photographs would be reclaimed and celebrated within the context of 1970s lesbian feminism. And here I'm showing you the cover of Dyke magazine from fall 1976, which has a colorized version and a cropped version of one of Alice's most iconic photographs. And I think that, as I said, the reclamation is clear, but I think there's also a certain loss. In this case, for example, that red and sky, we lose something of the historical specificity of the black and white visual world of the original image, but also, I think, Alice's intricate choreography and the compositional complexity of the original image, which you see here. I am showing you The Darned Club from 1891, the title of which, and that title is actually inscribed by, very unusually for Alice Austen to do this, it's inscribed in quotation marks on the negative, the glass plate negative. The title parrots the voice of an exasperated man excluded from the women's intimacy, but it also suggests, however lightly, the rebuke of late 19th century women who rejected the company of men. I want here, just briefly, for you to think about the ways in which the foursome is organized by Austen into two groups of two that are themselves matched and placed in intimate proximity, such, for example, while the two central women, Trude Eggleston and Julia Marsh, embrace the partners they face, and that's Alice Austen on the left and Julia Marsh, no, Alice Austen on the left and Sue Ripley on the far right. While they embrace the partners they face, they also brush up against one another from the rear. Similarly, even as the two outside women are coupled with an immediate partner, they also bookend the group of four and help to constitute it as a collective, a club. To put it another way, we could say that while Alice embraces Trude and Sue embraces Julia, Alice and Sue also mirror and reach out to one another. The lovely arithmetic at play here may exceed the equation of 2 + 2 = 4, in part because we realize that the rhetoric of the image allows for no divisibility into fully independent couples, and in part because gestural symmetries and compositional mirroring means that the viewer may, as it were, change up the pairing, such that, for example, we see the right-facing Sue as an echo or slightly miniaturized double of the right-facing Julia. This is not even to mention the choreography of negative space formed by the slender gaps between the women, including the vase-like form at center. But more than any of this, what complicates the arithmetic of 2 + 2 = 4 is in The Darned Club is that one of the four figures, Alice, on the far left, also represents a fifth term in the equation. Alice is the photographer who composes the scene from without, from the other side of the camera's lens, even as she takes her place within that very composition. Rather than pursuing the question of whether Austen was a lesbian or should be identified as such today, I am more interested in attending to what might be called the erotics of her imagery, to her attentiveness to moments of female privacy and affection, but also to her insistence and expertise at pictorial composition, lighting, costuming, and, in a different sense, to the particularity of October 29th, 1891, and she also specified this was taken at 3 p.m. Austen was a committed technician of photography, but she was also, I would claim, an important turn of the 20th century American artist, in the sense that she conceived and composed unforgettable pictures by combining her dedication to visual form with unorthodox or largely overlooked subject matter. Ultimately, Austen's work is, for me, most profoundly queer, not because it documents late 19th century female sexuality, or even because it was reclaimed in the 1970s in the post-Stonewall lesbian feminist pages of Dyke and Heresies. Rather, Austen's photographic vision is queer because of its commitment to non-normative moments of pleasure and masquerade, but also, and less affirmative, to non-normative scenes of quarantined immigrants and street laborers. Austen's photographs continue to matter today because they still ask us to imagine other possibilities for women, for the poetics of everyday life, for the proximity and the distance between ourselves and others, between you and me. What I find in the end so transporting about a photograph like The Darn Club is that it does not simply record a moment of physical affection among four friends on the front lawn of Clear Comfort on an October afternoon in 1891. It is rather that the image right now, for us tonight, models a view of the world based on intimacy, support, and mutuality, in a word, on love. And it models what that might look like. Given the countervailing worldviews currently on offer in American political and public life, it seems to me that Austen's model is one we would do well to embrace.
So thank you. Thank you for your insights and for helping us to contextualize Alice Austen and her work. We'd like to open up the floor to questions.
Hi, thank you all very much. I wonder which photographs collections did she want to sell?
Well, she sold the street types. She made an album of them, and they were for sale. And she copyrighted the quarantines, many of the quarantine pictures. I'm not sure they were for sale, but they were used by the Public Health Service. And she probably wanted to sell the World's Fair photographs, because in order to make photographs like that at the World's Fair, which Jessie Tarbuck Spiels made, Frances Benjamin Johnson made her, people that in her cohort, you actually had to get licensed by the fair, and you would make views of the fair, and the fair would help you sell those views, and those are official World's Fair views. So my guess is she was trying to sell those as well.
I would guess also that she had no intention of marketing photographs such as the Darn Club or Trude and I Masked. I think those were for private consumption passed among her friends.
And I think we know that because these photographs would never have been copyrighted, nor were they ever reproduced, unlike the quarantine photographs in the moment, in her lifetime. But I do think it's important, as I know you do, we all do, that they endure. I mean, now they are public, and so I think the whole history, as you've written about, of things that were made for a private world, that still is history.
And I think one of the curious things that we've wondered as scholars and discussed in our group is after the crash of 1929, it seems like the most obvious resource that the couple had to fall back on would have been Alice's photography at some point. And it's rather curious that she doesn't seem to turn back to that and try to either make new photographs that could be sold or remarket the ones that she had sold, at least not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, so I think in a way she's professional in terms of her devotion to her craft of photography, but she doesn't ever seem to view it as an opportunity for money making or self-support, which is something that sets her apart from some of the other early female photographers who actually did manage to make a living from photography. So I think that might be linked to her family situation in Staten Island, to the community that she came from. That didn't seem acceptable for her to pursue any sort of a lucrative career. And you get the sense that when they ran the tea room, it was a very reluctant enterprise.
I'd like to ask a question. She was a very avid boater, and I see there was a pier that had jutted out. I remember some of the pilings that was in that pier. I noticed you didn't show any of the pictures of her boating and the history of her. There was a boat club there also. She was very much involved in the harbor. There was many pictures that she took when she went out there. And is there any reason why you didn't show the boating and that particular pier? That's a lot of history right there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And she had a lot of boating pictures, and it's really just a question of what we had time for. So we just kind of focused on a few things. But certainly the boating was very significant to her, and I think it's interesting that she was so involved in these very physical activities and seemed to do them all so skillfully.
I had a question about, you created a context for her in the history of photography, but we don't really see her in relation to other photographers. I was wondering if she had any relationships with other photographers. I know that there was a photographer, Isaac Olmsted, who lived on Staten Island, would have been an exact contemporary of hers. But if there were any other photographers that she looked at or knew.
Oh, sorry. I mean, we know that she was a member of, right, the New Jersey Camera Club. I mean,
Yeah, there were camera clubs. In New York, there's a tremendous scene at this time. She's not part of that. Instead, she's part of, a different kind, popular mechanics. I mean, and she chooses the Otter Camera Club, the more amateur camera club. She's not having a social life with other photographers, and yet she was meeting other photographers at the World's Fairs, other women photographers. It's not that she was unknown as a photographer. It's just that her practice of photography is about this life that she's creating, and it's not about the practice of photography as a life with other photographers. That was what was getting interesting in New York. That's what Stieglitz was saying. You could do this. F. Holland Day was doing. I mean, there was a way to be a photographer. Her photograph. She is a photographer, but she's devoted to figuring out about this life, and that's where they're so extraordinary. It's these images of this life, and she would have given these photographs to her social. Other people would have had them. Her group of friends certainly knew she was doing this. I mean, the chemicals are smelly, they stain your hands. She's doing this devotedly, decade after decade. So she's known as a photographer, but she's not making a public life as a photographer with, say, Gertrude Kaisebier, who at the same time is running a studio in New York successfully, is exhibiting, is winning prizes, or Frances Benjamin Johnston, who's going to the Paris World's Fair of 1900. These are, and around, across Europe, across the United States, becoming a very important public photographer. Alice Austen is not doing that. She's focused on if one can say, the queerness of the domesticity of her moment that she's living, and she's finding images for that, and she's producing a corpus that is unlike any other. I mean, maybe the closest is maybe Lady Clementina Haywarden, who is dressing up her family and taking pictures in England, or perhaps Cameron, who is also enacting the Idylls of the King and dressing people up and doing things. But this is the life they're living rather than the fictions that they are recreating. And that's what's so extraordinary to me about them.
I think I just wanted to amplify or one thing that Laura just said that I think is crucial, which is that we need a different model of how art history, the history of photography, and also curatorial practice, professional curatorial practice is organized, because we have to stop, I believe, I say this to my students all the time, with this notion that a photographer has to be placed in relation to other photographers, as though the only way a photographer can respond to the world is through a dialogue with other photographers, as opposed to, say, a dialogue with Dr. Doty, or a dialogue with the world, the incredibly imaginative and vibrant world of women. That, you know, they're not other photographers, but they are authors, they're gymnasts. Gertrude Tate was an educator and a dancer. Those can all be artistic and photographic, in this case, inspirations. And I think that if, you know, we talk about now the outsider artist, I mean, I think it would make sense to think about Alice Austen as a kind of outsider artist, which is what makes her work so compelling. It is not trying to be modernist. It is not trying to be documentary. It doesn't look like anybody else's work you can name. That should be a good thing. And one of my one of my things that I don't like about art history often, even though I was schooled in it, maybe that's why I don't like it, is this idea that when there's a new artist who's kind of either emerging into visibility or being retrieved from obscurity, that they immediately have to be placed in some matrix of all the other artists that we know. And I think this does a grave disservice to the history of creativity and also of the life of creative people.
Okay, yeah. No, I agree with you. But it's also a serious question. It's like, what other photographers? One other photographer is F. Holland Day, who in Norwood, Massachusetts, is creating, a queer life, and there are Louise Guiney, I think is how you pronounce it, the poet. There are, but he's a man.
Had no relationship
No,
to them, so
no.
I don't think why do we need to bring in this other analogy? I mean, I just think that's what I'm exactly saying.
Yeah, because he asked.
Well, that doesn't mean we have to answer. That doesn't mean we have to provide.
Okay, well.
I don't know. I mean.
Could I just defend myself a little bit? I think I'm also an artist and an art historian and a curator, and I have no problem with artists relating to other artists. We are nourished by those relationships.
But also by other relationships.
You can't talk with someone who may be intellectually very interesting, but you can't get that stimulus from another person who's not involved in the trade, so to speak.
But listen, she wasn't involved in the trade. She wasn't pursuing it for most of the time. That all these photographs that we saw, almost all of them, she was not in a financial position where she would ever have conceived of this as a professional in the sense of a money making or something. She had.
In New York City.
No, well, she lived on Staten Island. If she lived in New York, well, by which I mean, I think that if Alice Austen had lived in Greenwich Village, she would by now be a canonical figure. I think that there is this bias also still, not Brooklyn anymore, but against outer boroughs, and that this notion of Manhattan as still the sort of validation of artistic value. And I really have an allergy to this notion, because let me just give one example, which is those photographs. Another kind of professional, she made these photographs for her friend Maria Ward's book, Bice Looking for Ladies. She made these still images from which then engravings. The photographs themselves don't appear in the book. But she's inspired by the work that her friend, who's an author, not another photographer. I don't think Alice Austen was looking to other photographers, male or female, for her inspiration. As you say, her inspiration was this incredibly vibrant world on Staten Island, and then the laboring in the streets and the quarantining. That's the world. And I don't know why it's so hard sometimes for art historians anyway, to deal with that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no. In the front? Right here?
Hi, sorry. So, totally new subject. I'm curious whether there's anything particular or noteworthy or historical about the moment that came at the end of her life where her work all of a sudden was coming into public view again. I wonder.
Are you asking if there was something? It was a totally extraordinary moment. Do you know the story?
No, I'm curious about the story and what the reasons for that moment were.
She was 82 years old. She was in a poor nursing home, the Poor Farm on Staten Island. And she was basically lying in an iron bedstead like the ones that she photographed in Hoffman and Swinburne Islands in the dormitories for the immigrants. A bare light bulb overhead staring at the ceiling. And what's his name? What's Oliver Jensen had found some photographs and traced her there. He made enlarged copies of some of them, and he took them, and he sat by her bed, and he tried to talk to her, and she wouldn't answer him. And then he, in sort of desperation, he recounts that he waved one of these enlargements of her photograph in front of her face, and she opened her eyes, and she said, "Where did you get that?" And she said, "That was Trudy." Or that's this, and she started talking to him. And she came out of that, depression, despair, by means of his communicating with her over those photographs. That's the story. And then he came back, he alerted people that she was there, they raised money to get her out of there, and then he had a celebration for her. There was an exhibit, Alfred Eisenstadt photographed it, it's in Life magazine. It is an incredible story of what happened to her at the end. I will say it's also not that far away from us. You know, I was thinking, I had a teacher in college, Belle Chevignet, who taught me at Sarah Lawrence College, and she remembered going to their tea room and remembered as a child learning to dance from Gertrude. It's not there. They're next door to us. It wasn't so long ago. And yet we haven't had these photographs. I mean, those of us who are enthusiasts have had them, but more people should have them to live with, because the life that she photographed is both gone, but also hauntingly present. Its concerns, its fragility, its, as Richard said so beautifully at the end, it's this notion of solidarity and love at a moment of when we're imperiled. Along those lines, the women-identified relationships, all of this are very contemporary. It's not so long ago.
I'm struck too by the fairy tale quality of the story.
Yeah.
Here she was in poverty and almost catatonic, and suddenly she's been discovered, and she had one wonderful year, and that was the end of it. She was discovered in 1951, and she died in 1952.
Yeah, and I think as amazing as it is, it also matters that it happened in the early 1950s, which was a time when her relationship with her partner, Gertrude Tate, could not really be named. So Gertrude Tate is just described as a friend. So if you read the Life magazine piece, it's this really amazing sort of unearthing of her work and a reintroduction of Alice Austen. But her personal life, to me, seems to be very papered over. And I think, you know, oftentimes we think of history in progressive terms, and we sort of assume that things are just getting better, and there's more freedom, and there's more openness. I think, in fact, the Boston marriage that she had for much of her life, I mean, she actually, as subversive as it was, she lived the way that she wanted to live. But in the early 50s, when she was rediscovered, that couldn't even really be named.
My question, in a way, relates to the former question. Would any of you happen to know how Oliver Jensen came across those photographs in his research for the book? And do you feel that if he hadn't been doing that project, would her work somehow have surfaced one way or another? Is it just one of those?
He was working on a book called
Yes.
The Revolt of American Women, and he had sent an assistant to the Staten Island Historical Society. She discovered these glass plates and some prints, and he went back and he said, "Can I talk to people who knew this photographer?" And he was told that she was still alive, and he was sent to the poorhouse where he found her.
But I think that that's very important. I mean, the book, The Revolt of American Women, was about these iconoclastic women, and the very fact that there were, I mean, it's, in a way, a sort of, popularized version of women's studies and women's history. And I think that that reclamation, and that it could also then lead to Life magazine, and that there was a way in which that, I don't even know that that would have been conceptualized in those terms, a book called The Revolt of American Women.
Second wave feminism.
Right, but this is in 1950.
Yeah.
And so I think that we see here that there are ways in which a certain different foundations, and I think lesbian feminism in the 70s is another one. Different moments that aren't Alice Austen's, I mean, she has 1 year, but that moment is really what's going on, as you're saying, in the 50s and what's going on with popular culture and Life magazine, but also the beginnings of a sense, you know what, we need to hear women's voices in American history. We don't really know half or more than half the story.
I was struck by the fact that the revolt of American women was a very revolutionary notion, of course, to look at women rebels in the 1950s when women were so conformist, and yet he does it very self-consciously.
Yeah.
He almost laughs at some of these women.
Yeah, and that we have to have this man. I always took the revolt of American women to also be a pun, and not on his part witty, but like they're sort of revolted by him. But anyway.
I had a question about the Alice Austen house today. I think it was mentioned by Janice that you want, the intention is to redo a section of the house that's very genteel and beautiful into something new that somehow works with your work. If we could just go down the line, like what should we have in that house? What would do something for each one of your work that would have resonance with the community and with New York and with people visiting and coming to see this great work?
I would like to see much more of a presence of Gertrude Tate in that house because Tate was so important to her life.
As much as I think it would upset Richard, I would actually like to see Austen's work, as I did a little bit, contextualized with what other photographers are doing at the time, because I think it highlights the fact that what she's doing is so very different and so very radical.
Yeah, and I want to say, I want Alice Austen to be incorporated into art history and photo history. I just don't want it to be like, oh, well, this is the context, this is what her inspirations were. Because I think the idea that her photograph should be in dialogue, like I loved it that you showed it with Jacob Riis. Oh, wait, was that you? It was, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, but I think we have to understand that as our needs historically, in terms of looking back at a whole range of photographic practitioners, not to make it, I think the fantasy of art history is to make these as though the dialogues were happening then. The dialogue was not happening for her then. The dialogue is for us now looking at all these different photographs. How do we think about what was going on in the larger history and culture, and how did it shape someone like Alice Austen versus Jacob Riis versus other female photographers and so forth, photographers of different class? I mean, those are the questions that I think we have. I don't want her only to have her own room or her own house. I mean, the photographs to only be there. They have to be put into a large. I just don't want that history to be retroactively projected onto her work as what caused her to, or what inspired her.
Right. No, of course, I do think it's not an unworthwhile question, though, to consider who she might have encountered, not necessarily as an inspiration, but maybe as a rejection. I mean, maybe just to sort of think about if she had a larger awareness, and I suggested this a little bit because I don't know, we haven't, I don't know if that scholarship's been done, think about like who she might have been aware of, just because it was such a rich moment in photographic history.
She was in the New Jersey Camera Club, so she was aware. I mean, no, think about it. She
Yeah,
made
she
Albertypes. There were there's thousands of other Albertypes. I mean, why are we looking to to a photo history of individual makers when her interest, I think, as you were arguing, is really in a kind of popular culture of photography and science, and that's the issue where I feel like often art history and museum culture, it just really wants to assimilate any creative person into into a community of named great, progressive other photographers and artists. And I feel like, no, let's actually look at the broader culture that she's responding, including the proto-lesbian.
But we can do both, can't we?
We can, but I just think it does a certain my own feeling, and I know I'm on a soapbox here, but a Pear's soapbox, but there's the nuns are wearing Pear's soapbox habits. But I don't know, I think we need to challenge ourselves to move beyond that model where each artist gets sort of slotted into a matrix of other artists. When the world is so much bigger for artists, then, they deal with everyone, hopefully.
I think you can think of her as an early techie. And I think she belongs in feminist science and technology studies as much as she does in photography. And what I like to see is some kind of genius installation that makes use of the boats, makes use of the water, makes use of the ships, makes use of the islands, the plague islands, that's what they are called, the autoclave that is, this, I can imagine something at the edge of the water that's a beautiful installation that's made by a contemporary artist that's able to make this underground history palpable, because that's the pattern of the life that she lived. And that would help make it more apparent.
I would really like to see more about the household and all of the different people that lived there. For much of her life, she was living with family members. She lived with her aunt and uncle. She lived with her mother. And then also all of the servants that were living with them and waiting on them. And she had some really interesting pictures that she took of the servants. So I would like the house to kind of show some of the class relations and the ways that those were lived out in a place like Clear Comfort.
And I would like, this is actually the front yard of the house, if you haven't been there, so it has this incredible view of the Narrows and many of the gardens. I mean, I would like something outside. I mean, some way to sort of think about how Alice is using this house as a kind of a stage set. I mean, the way in which she poses these women on the lawn, but against the water, and how important that view we know was to her. I would like somehow to use the view and sort of bring Alice out, as it were, of the inside. She didn't only exist inside that house. She was constantly moving out into the world.
Hi, I just wondered if the scholars had any written documentation to draw from, or if you were entirely basing your research on photography, and if in that written documentation there was any suggestion of Alice's intention for art versus reportage, or if in fact her reportage has become art with high history and hindsight, if you see what I mean. Thanks.
That's a great question. I think that what we probably all would say is that more research needs to be done at this, and I would love to get into her archives and actually see what evidence there is. Right now, mostly what we have to go on is this book by Anne Novotny that Richard mentioned. But from what I've heard from other people who have looked at her papers is that there's not a tremendous amount there in terms of letters or diaries that might shed more light on this.
But you also have to ask why. If that written record isn't there, it doesn't mean that it wasn't made. It may also mean it was destroyed, or it may mean that somebody has it and it's just been put away for a better time. So we don't know. I've been in the archive, and she took notes. She was very, very good about writing where she took the photographs. But there's amazingly little written document. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name is Chris. I work at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art, and I just wanted to say thank you for putting this together. It's so fantastic, and also that it's just incredibly well curated the way that it ran out. I was particularly struck, especially because I have a kind of new obsession with Jo Carstairs, which is not a new obsession, but rather a resurfacing, who also has a link, is a boating woman, as it were. She was a boat racer. And was born maybe about 40 years after Alice Austen, but was a New York resident and back and forth. So this idea about newness and speed, I was quite struck by that. And then also just as a kind of queer strategy on sort of self-imaging that I see echoed in more contemporary artists like Kathy Cade, for instance, who teaches photography as well. So I wondered also about the connection to camera clubs, and was there some desire, or is there any evidence that she also was helping other people to self-image, especially at a time when, as you say, the history is unwrit, the history of our sex, our sexuality, and our intimacies. We're left to read backwards in a way, in the echo of that void. So I'm wondering sort of about those two specific things.
I don't know if that's such a wonderful question. I don't know of her teaching others. I mean, she's taught by her family members. I think Gertrude wound up knowing quite a bit about photographing, but I don't know anything about her teaching children or anybody else. And yet that idea that bringing the children to learn about photographing seems resonant and right. But I'm not sure she's teaching. I don't know. Do you know?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we might think about is the ways that some of these private photographs that she made might have circulated, and whether she gave them to friends, other people who participated in these kinds of subversive moments. If she gave them to those people as keepsakes, we don't really know, but it's kind of a tantalizing idea.
I just wanted to say about the last part of your question, about the self, kind of the use of photography and maybe also a certain kind of comportment and a certain address to the camera and a certain sometimes costuming. There were two moments I was very moved by I mean, more than two, but one was when Lara said about the caption of the photograph with the dog, self starting out for Chicago. When Alice writes, instead of saying AA or me, or she says self, and it is almost as though there is a self, I think, created, and this is a feminist issue, whether or not she was part of the suffragette movement, which apparently that to me, for us now, I mean, looking back at the history of women's experience, and I think it could also be understood in relation to trying to forge, as a woman, an identity outside of marriage with, sustain a relationship with another woman when there is going to be recriminations, let's say from your immediate family, like your sister, not to, but the other moment was when you said, which I would never, I guess as a man, like I've learned, I don't ever say anything about people's appearance in the images, like of men or women. I just don't feel, anyway. But I really liked it when you said like she was not a beautiful woman, or about Gertrude Tate.
But that's such a glamorous, romantic
right, and that's what I thought. I thought, well, here you'd make your lover or you make your partner into, I mean, it's the photograph and the lighting and the dress and the way Gertrude is, kind of looking at, but like that glamour is not this, or it's not about this beauty that's just the physical appearance. It's about how we fashion ourselves and our world. And for her, I think the camera and the space of clear comfort, and then the journey she went on to the streets of New York or to Quarantine Island, these were places where she could, I think, craft a different self, different possibilities for being alive that she wanted. She didn't want the conventional possibility, the conventional what was expected. She didn't want to get married. She didn't want to sit home. She didn't want to have kids. I'm not saying that people who get married and have kids always just sit home, but you know what I'm saying. I know that but
in those days.
Right, and as you said, she did, in a sense, get married, but she didn't want to get married to a man, I should say.
And I think in a certain sense, Bicycling for Ladies, her participating in that project was very much linked to wanting to give all women the wherewithal to go out and ride bikes. She didn't want people to be intimidated by that. She had great facility with tools, and I think that that's, reflected in some of the mechanical pictures in Bicycling for Ladies. There's pictures of, how to turn over your bike. So just things like that, sort of giving people permission, giving ladies permission who picked up this book to say it's perfectly acceptable for you to take, to become a bicyclist and for you to have tools and know how to fix your bike. I mean, it seems kind of basic, but I think at the moment it was actually rather profound.
And I don't think anyone here would disagree with me that however, wonderful all of our everyone's presentations have been, it is still a scratching of the surface. And I think there are troves possibly of unmined information. Like, I don't know if anyone's gone through the archives of the New Jersey Camera Club and really tried to see if she, maybe there are records in there that she was teaching, other people here and there. I don't know if Novotny did that, and I feel like that would be something, when we go deeper, that's something that there are areas that might reveal more.
Okay, one last question.
Two last questions. That's right. Hi. I want to thank you guys for everything, but when you look into this deeper, look at where she is. She's in Staten Island in the late 1800s, where I had my aunts and uncles down the street from her, great aunts and uncles, where my mom resides in the house my grandfather built in 1888, about a mile away from her house. That island was so isolated. A ferry goes in, a ferry goes out. So she lived, to me, her life, quietly, privately. The photographs just are a blessing to us, today's generation that can appreciate it. But as you're looking into it, I could tell you from stories going back way when, people did not want to know what was happening in your house. Seriously, they didn't want to know. They'd say hello to you on the street, hi to you at church, but she, to me, lived a secret life, and the only way she could express it, living with a partner for all those years, taking pictures of her friends, her companion, things that she can enjoy and embrace and appreciate herself. This is what I see. But I gotta say one thing about that Hoffman Island, and I know this for a fact, 3 generations on Staten Island. There had to have been something that that doctor saw in her talent for a female at that time to go to that island. And you guys have hit the surface, and I am so looking forward to seeing you go so deep, because there is going to be so much more you will uncover, and I'm just going to eat it up. Thank you.
Okay, I think that is a wonderful place for us to end. I want everyone to thank our scholars for being so fantastic tonight. And thank you, audience, for being so interested in Alice Austen. Thank you.